بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل.
These days we're celebrating the life and the history of our Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. As such, given the circumstances we see in the world today about Islam, I thought I'll touch upon our Holy Prophet being a humanitarian hero. Just as an initial start, though, we may begin with our Holy Prophet as the start where he began. So our Holy Prophet ﷺ was born in the city of Mecca, as we see in the screen here. I can walk around here, of course, just stand still. He was born in the city of Mecca, and then he stayed there until the age of 40. At the age of 40 is when he received the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At that point, he started preaching to the people of Mecca about the message of Islam for 13 years, after which he was forced to leave the city of Mecca and migrate to the city of Medina, which is right there on the screen. And that's where he built the Prophet's mosque, or al-Masjid al-Nabawi, and he remained there for about 10 years, after which, unfortunately, he left this world at the age of 63. So that's a brief history of our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. In the Quran, we believe in him as a role model. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us that if you want a successful role model, follow the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sallam. Allah describes him as compassionate and merciful, Ra'ufun Rahim, a person who has great manners. Indeed, he is a humanitarian hero. It's important when you're introducing our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa sallam, as we describe him, we sometimes are asked, well, you're giving your opinion of the Prophet as a follower of him, and hence are we biased? However, if we take a look at individuals who have no bias towards the Holy Prophets, one example is Thomas Carroll. He's a British philosopher. In a lecture he gave back in 1840, titled The Hero. This series of lectures are published now, they're available online, you can find them. In the second series of his lectures, he talked about the Prophet. Now he spelled it with a T, Muhammad, which is the Turkish way of saying the Prophet's name. Gotta remember, 1840, that was during the Ottoman Empire. In his lecture that he gave, this is what he says: the lies which well-meaning zeal has heaped round this man, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa sallam, are disgraceful to ourselves only. He continues to add, a man rather taciturn in speech, in other words, he does not speak much, silent when there was nothing to be said, but pertinent, wise, sincere when he did speak, always throwing light on the matter. This is the only sort of speech worth speaking. Through light, we find him to have been regarded as an altogether solid, brotherly, genuine man. That's one thing about our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Edward Gibbon, in the history of service and empire, the greatest success of Muhammad's life was affected by sheer moral force without the stroke of a sword. And that's something important. Today, unfortunately, as Muslims, we're regarded as individuals who are constantly associated, unfortunately, with terrorism. The reality is, of course, the exact opposite. Islam is a religion of love, compassion, of peace. This was the true nature of our Holy Prophet ﷺ. In one of the battles, the Prophet ﷺ, during the time of afternoon, decided to rest. Battles back in those days were a little bit different from this modern day war. Back then, they used to fight for some time, and then they would take a break. They would take a break, and then they would come back and continue the fight. So during one of these breaks in the afternoon, the Prophet ﷺ sat under a tree to rest. His companions were away from him. His sword was not with him. One of the enemies, a man by the name of Carroll, thought that this is the perfect opportunity for me to get rid of him. He's alone, unarmed, his men are away from him. This is the perfect time. Carroll then approaches the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and he stands right next to him, holding his sword. The Prophet is lying down. He tells the Prophet, "Man sayunajjika minni al-an ya Muhammad?" Who's going to save you from me now, O Muhammad? You're unarmed by yourself. Your companions are away from you. I have the sword and I'm standing up. Who will save you? The Holy Prophet ﷺ looks at him and bravely says to him, Allahu yunajjini. God will save you. These words literally moved Carroll. He was moved by it. People are moved by the truth, especially oppressors. When you speak the truth to oppressors, they are shaken, taken aback. Just yesterday, we heard of the news of the killing of a great man, Sheikh Imam. May Allah bless his soul. He was captured and taken and killed because of his words. His words were too powerful, that they were shaking the tyrants, the oppressors. These words of our Holy Prophet ﷺ moved Carroll. He trembled and he fell down. The Prophet immediately got up, took the sword from him, and said, Carroll, now who's going to save you from me? Carroll looked at the Holy Prophet and he said, Hilmuka ya Muhammad. Your forbearance, your forgiveness will save me from you. And the Prophet looked at him and said, Sadaqta ya Carroll. You're right. Take your sword back. And he gives him the sword back. Carroll goes back. His companions asked him, where did you go, Carroll? Where were you? And he explained to them what happened. And he said, I have never seen a man so honorable as him. Our Holy Prophet at that point was the head of the state. So this is an attempted assassination of the head of the state. This is attempted murder. And the Prophet had the ability, yet he forgave him and let him go. This was the compassion of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. And he did this more than one occasion. Last night I spoke about him coming back to Mecca and how he forgave all those people who fought against him for more than 20 years. Such a man, it's a pride for us to follow, is indeed a role model. Some might ask, what about the conquests, the way Islam was spread? What about that? In response to that, Professor Jonas Bezito, who's actually a professor at George Washington University, he's got a book called Islam, the Straight Path. In chapter 2, read what he says. In many ways, local populations found Muslim rule more flexible and tolerant than that of the Byzantium and Persia. Religious communities were free to practice their faith, to worship, and be governed by their religious leaders and laws in such areas as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. In other words, when Islam used to go to an area, if that area was predominantly Christian, for example, Islam would lead them with their own laws. It would not force them to convert. It would not harm them. In addition, he adds, saying, for these reasons, some Jewish and Christian communities aided the invading armies. They worked with them, regarding them as less oppressive than their imperial masters. So people saw Muslims and Islam as liberating, not oppressive. And indeed, there's a beautiful verse in the Quran, my brothers and my sisters. Allah says in Surah Al-Hajj, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَهُدِّمَتْ صَوَامِعُ وَبِيَعٌ وَصَلَوَاتٌ وَمَسَاجِدُ يُذْكَرُ فِيهَا اسْمُ اللَّهِ كَثِيرًا. If it were that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses some people to defend others, then you would have had temples, synagogues, churches, and mosques being destroyed. In other words, Allah uses temples first, synagogues second, churches third, and then mosques. Muslims who defend, they don't only defend Muslims, they defend humanity. We saw an example, and in fact are seeing an example of this today in Iraq. The terrorist armies that invaded Iraq and caused some Christians, Sunnis, Muslims, Shias, Yazidis, and others to flee their cities and towns and go elsewhere. The army that came to defend, which was predominantly Muslims, predominantly Shia, they did not only come to defend their fellow Shia, they came to defend their fellow human beings, be it Christian, Yazidi, or whatever they may be. That's what Islam is about. In Imam Ali, the voice of human justice, George Jordan, gives some beautiful description of our Holy Prophet. He says, the shade of Muhammad spread so much that the entire old world came under it, and the land from the east up to the west began producing the fruits of goodness, knowledge, peace, and friendship. The Prophet of Islam stretched his hand and sowed the seeds of friendship and brotherhood throughout the world. That hand is still stretched and is busy sowing the seeds. Hence, there is no part of the world wherein the followers of Muhammad are not found, including in this city, Windsor, Ontario. examples of some non-biased individuals. These are non-Muslims. This is some of their examples and description of our Holy Prophet ﷺ. How did our Prophet ﷺ manage to do this? In some of those ways. One, living by example. Ammar ibn Yasir, the Prophet's companion, says, as we were building the Prophet's mosque in Medina, we would carry one brick at a time. The Prophet would carry 2 bricks at a time. He was building with us. We would become tired. We want to take a rest. We see him hard at work. This encourages us to work further and harder. To lead by example. That's how the Prophet managed to change a culture, managed to change traditions. I was talking to some brothers and sisters the other day, just last night in fact. I told them to imagine how difficult it would be to change a culture. I mean, just think about it. For example, here in Canada, if you take a look at the Canadian culture, alcohol is an integral part of this culture today. Imagine if you come to this culture and you want to stop them from interacting or consuming alcohol. How would you do so? And how difficult it would be to do so. To change this entire culture and stop them from drinking alcohol, dealing with alcohol, and so on and so forth. Our Holy Prophet came to a similar culture. They also used to drink. And that was just one aspect of them that he had to deal with. There were so many other aspects he had to deal with. So many other challenges. He had to work really hard. He had to lead by example. That's one thing. Second, his manners and attitude. How do we compare to the Holy Prophet ﷺ in regards to our manners and our attitude? At the time of our Holy Prophet ﷺ, there were slaves and maids. In Canada, we don't really have many, usually servants. Usually don't have that many. Maybe in some other parts, in Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, other places, you might have some servants who will come and work in the house. Those servants, unfortunately, are sometimes looked down at home. Unfortunately. Slaves are even of a lower class because they're not even free. They're owned. Socially speaking, a slave has no right and is at the bottom of the social class, if we may have that expression. Although Islam came to abolish these terms by saying, "Inna akramakum inda Allahi atqakum." Indeed, the most honorable amongst you before Allah is the one with the highest piety. So that's really the class. Nonetheless, slaves were looked down upon, disrespected. One day, our Holy Prophet ﷺ in Medina, as he was walking by, he saw a maid, a slave, a woman. She was sitting on the side, crying. The Prophet is the head of the state, from Bani Hashim. He's a Prophet of Allah. He stops. He approaches that slave, that lady, and asks, "What is the matter? Why are you crying?" This lady raises her head and she finds the Holy Prophet is standing there. She's shocked. No one stops to listen to a slave. The Prophet says, "What is the matter? Why are you crying?" She said, "My masters gave me some money to buy something, but I lost this money, and I don't know what to do." The Prophet said, "Don't worry about it. How much did they give you?" She gave them the amount. So he took that amount and gave it to her. He said, "Here, take the money." Go and buy whatever you need. The Prophet then walked. A little while later, he came by the same place. He saw the same lady still sitting there and crying again. Stop. He said, what is the matter? Why are you crying now? She said, well, I went to buy what you told me, what they wanted of me. I bought it. However, I'm afraid of going back because I took so long. I'm afraid I might be punished. The Prophet ﷺ said, don't worry. Get up, I will go with you. The Prophet walked with her to her house. The Prophet knocked on the door himself and said, Assalamu alaikum. No one answered. He knocked the second time, Assalamu alaikum. No one replies. He knocks a third time, Assalamu alaikum. Then the response comes and the door opens. Wa alayka assalam, ya Rasulallah, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Prophet asked, why didn't you respond when I first knocked the door? The man said in the house, Ya Rasulallah, we love to hear your voice. So when you gave the salam the first time, I quietly replied, because I wanted to hear your voice again. So when you gave the second salam, again I replied quietly. The third time, I thought now it's time for me to open the door. So thank you for coming to my house, Ya Rasulullah, and for making me hear you. The Prophet said, I came here because of your maid. She's afraid that you would punish her. The man said, Ya Rasulullah, you came to my house for a maid? He said, yes, she's a human being. I wanted to help her out. The man said, if she is the reason to bring you, Ya Rasulullah, to my doorstep, then I let her go free for you, Ya Rasulullah. This is the akhlaq of the Holy Prophet. Helping people, giving a helping hand. That's what gained him the love of people. If we want people's true love, respect, it's through our manners, through our character. If we change ourselves to be the best, then we will attract people's respect and the love of Allah and His Messenger. Through these actions, through His divine message, sincerity, His patience and perseverance, through His respect for humanity, He managed to introduce these changes. Now something interesting, going back to Thomas Carlyle for a minute here. In this long passage, in that same series I mentioned, The Heroes, back in 1814, Thomas Carlyle introduces something interesting. He says that Arabia was living a nomadic life, simple life, a primitive life. Then, with the coming of the Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, within less than a century, Muslims ruled 2/3 of the world. He sparked a revolution. He sparked a change. So that's something quite interesting. So if we may think of it this way, the Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ did not really have much of a civilization. There were nomads, living like a flat line until the Prophet comes. All of a sudden, then Muslims rise. Something happens. Inventions start to develop. Scientists start to come. Scholars start to become inventors. And Muslims develop their golden years. The way he describes it is that Arabia is long ages over a great section of the world. That's something interesting. In the Muslims' contribution to world civilization, in this book, the editor says it is by no means an exaggeration to state that it was Europe's encounter with Muslims and Muslim civilization that became the engine of the European Renaissance. Do you see what's happening here? Muslims were dormant until the Prophet came. All of a sudden, Muslims, the Arabs were dormant until the Prophet came. Then Islam was introduced. Muslims became inventors, scholars, scientists. Muslims then met and encountered the Europeans. Europeans then developed the Renaissance. That led me to the following hypothesis. Muslim scholars and scientists were the driving engine for modern civilization. Okay? Prophet Muhammad is the driving engine for Muslim scholars and scientists. Therefore, we can say the following. Prophet Muhammad is the driving engine for modern day civilization. In other words, a lot of the inventions, the technologies that we have before us today, the spark was introduced by our Holy Prophet. In a book called 1001 Inventions, it was edited by a professor from the University of Manchester, Salim al-Hassani. This 1001, basically he took 1001 inventions by Muslims and put them together in this book. This became a global exhibition today. If you go actually online, 1001 inventions, it's an exhibition. So the book became a great hit, great success. In the book, he says, as one example of the inventions of Muslims, many of the most important advances in the study of optics came from the Muslim world. Especially a man by the name of Ibn al-Haytham or al-Haytham. Al-Haytham invented something called the camera obscura. This camera obscura became the significant contribution to the principles of optics and the use of scientific experiments, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. In other words, I see a lot of people on their mobile phones these days, mashallah. Right now, as I speak, I see a lot of them carrying these things. I guess Muslims can be blamed for this, where a wife is trying to convince her husband of buying her a smartphone, but she's not calling it that. She says, no, this is a smart camera. A camera that lets you make a phone call, update your Facebook status, upload photos, music, buy apps, etc., etc. We may also be blamed for this. I think many of us experience that, where the son is quite happy with his iPhone, the daughter with her iPod, the wife with her iPad, and the father saying, I pay. So, may I ask, how many of you had coffee this morning? Coffee? I say Alhamdulillah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who created coffee. Alhamdulillah. And you know what's even greater? Alhamdulillah, He did not make it haram to consume. Alhamdulillah. It's even greater. Those of you who are addicted to caffeine and coffee, my friends, I said his excitement, of course. He's excited for having coffee. Maybe he's looking for some. Yeah. So, coffee, my friends, was actually discovered by Muslims. It was discovered by Sufis, Muslim mystics. They use in Yemen, that's what they discovered. Sufis wanted to stay up at night praying. They discovered these beans. When they boil them and brew them, and they drink the extract, it helped them stay up the whole night. That was a wonderful thing. When the Europeans came to Yemen, interacted with them, they liked these beans and took them to Europe. So that's how coffee was invented, my friends, or how it was discovered by the Yemeni Sufis. Interestingly, there was a paper published in 2007 in one of the most prestigious scientific journals called Science. This was published by a researcher at Harvard University. He's a mathematician. This mathematician at Harvard went to a mosque that is 400 years old in a Muslim country. He went there and he studied these shapes. Some of you may have seen some of these shapes in Muslim mosques. You know, these calligraphies or these geometrical shapes. Many Muslim monks have these shapes. This mathematician from Harvard went to this 400 years old mosque and studied these shapes. Interestingly, what he found is whomever designed these shapes 400 years ago knew of a mathematical formula that was only discovered in the mid-1970s. A formula that was only discovered in the mid-1970s. Whomever designed this knew this formula 400 years ago when he designed this mosque. This is where he showed, look how advanced Muslim mathematicians were, that they were 400 years ahead of their time. Islam has great significant contributions to the modern world. These were introduced by our Holy Prophet. This is something we need to really remind people about. Unfortunately, today, the face of Islam has become this. These terrorist groups, these terrorist organizations, push their agenda under the name of Islam. We need to remind ourselves and everyone else, these people do not represent Islam. They may call themselves Muslims, but they are terrorist groups, spreading fear, killing people. These are not Muslims, nor are their actions coming from Islam. We can remind people that Muslim scholars and individuals are still contributing to the world even in this day and age. Since 2005 until now, 4 of the Nobel Peace Prize winners have been Muslims. In 2005, Dr. Muhammad al-Biography of Egypt, he won the Nobel Prize for Peace. A year later, Professor Muhammad Yunus from Bangladesh won the Nobel Prize for Peace for establishing the microcredit system. In 2011, Tawakkul Kerman from Yemen with her hijab. She was the youngest individual at that time, 2011, to win the Nobel Prize for Peace at the age of 33. And that's something also to respond, that hijab does not stop Muslim women from progressing in any endeavor that they wish. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He dictated hijab and mandated it, our religion, when it prescribed it, it was to help women progress and succeed in all aspects of their lives. Most recently, a year ago, Malala Yousafzai, at the age of 17, became the youngest Nobel laureate for the Peace Prize. Interestingly, I want to share something here with you. Last year, unfortunately, in Ottawa, there was some tragic shootings where a person attacked the parliament. These events were indeed very tragic, and our heart aches for the soldier who was killed. That individual who committed these tragic acts was immediately labeled as a Muslim, who's driven by his ideologies to commit such acts. These actions indeed are tragic, and our heart aches for them, for those who are hurt by these tragic actions. However, interestingly, listen to this. That same day, Malala Yousafzai was supposed to be speaking in Ottawa. That same day, she was supposed to be receiving an honorary citizenship by the Prime Minister himself. That speech was cancelled. No one in the news, to the best of my knowledge, ever said, by the way, she's also a Muslim. And she's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. That never came in the news. Muslims continue to spread peace and justice. And speaking on that note, it's interesting to share this with you, my brothers and sisters, where it says, a nun can be covered from head to toe in order to devote herself to God, right? But then if a Muslim girl does the same, why is she oppressed? However, we do have hope in the world. In 2014, because of the bombings in Gaza, a church opened its doors to the Muslims to celebrate their Eid prayers. In Iraq, Christians were taken by the shrine of Imam Ali alayhi salam and were helped. In addition to this, in Berlin, they're building right now the House of One, which contains a church, a mosque, and a synagogue. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So there is hope, and we need to keep on building on this hope, where we, inshallah, will learn to respect one another as humanitarians. This love, this compassion, we learn as Muslims from our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. With that, I would like to thank you all very much. Jazakumullahu khairan. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.